Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Tyla, and I'm an SSI Science Communication intern this summer. And today, on our 8th episode of our Live with the SSI Interns series, we have a very special guest because usually when we're interviewing people, it's either me or Amy interviewing someone and the other in the background. But today, the interviewer becomes the interviewee. And we're going to start with Amy. So, to provide a bit of background, SSI stands for Summer Systematics Institute, and this REU, or Research Experience for Undergrads, is funded by the National Science Foundation. Now, we've interviewed all of our peers who work with curators or postdoc at the Cal Academy, but me and Amy are the SciComm interns, so our program's a little bit different. So we have some preset questions that we've arranged for ourselves, but please feel free to leave any comments or questions in the chat and we'll get to them as the discussion unfolds. Without further ado, I'm so excited to introduce you all, or I guess you've already been introduced, but to introduce you officially to our guest, Amy. Amy, would you like to tell us your hometown, pronouns, home institution, and anything else you want the audience to know?
Yeah, so hi everyone, my name is Amy. I guess this is the first time I'm formally introducing myself to everyone. So I use the she, her pronouns, and I was born and raised in San Diego, California. But I've been up here in the East Bay for about 4 or 5 years, ever since I started my undergrad program at UC Berkeley. And I'm super excited to be here with Tala. Super excited to watch Tala be both host and producer. I think she's had a lot of training this past couple of weeks, so very excited to be here.
Awesome. Thank you for that official introduction, Amy. So our first question, which is a question that we came up with because we thought it would be fun, and I don't know how we feel now that it's turned on us, but how would you explain your summer research project to a 5th grader?
Yeah, I feel a little mean for asking this of the other interns now that I'm in the hot seat, but essentially my project is I'm creating a mini comic series where each comic follows sort of the biographical life of a scientist that I've interviewed. So a lot of the scientists are here from the academy, but some of them aren't. So we ask them questions like, what was your most memorable field story? And how do you feel that your identity impacts your science and sort of your experience in science? So trying to get at sort of really exciting, lesser known types of science, and also trying to get at how science is very personable. And ultimately the goal is to see if comics, and specifically using comics as a medium to explore these more sort of personal science identity questions, will help engage younger audiences, so especially middle and high schoolers, in seeing themselves in STEM and wanting to actually be a part of STEM and stay, because research has shown that that's when we sort of lose a lot of people. So yeah, basically, in a nutshell, a mini comic series based off of the true stories of scientists from all across the Bay Area.
So tell me, Amy, how did you decide to do a comic series?
Yeah, so I actually originally applied to be a biological illustration intern here at the Cal Academy, and was informed that I unfortunately didn't get it. But then Laurel Allen, who runs the digital engagement team, which we now both work under, sent me an email and said, hey, like I selected, I think around 3 people that originally applied for the illustration position, but didn't get it because we have extra funding for another SciComm intern this summer. And so did an interview, and she had asked during the interview, you know, what project would you pitch for your independent research project? And I had, I think at that point at 2 separate occasions at Berkeley, seen like a PhD student and a professor who like showed us like science comics that they had made in collaboration with artists. And I just thought it was a really cool medium that I personally hadn't really explored a lot. And it allowed me to both combine my like interest in pursuing art again, through this SciComm lens. And so it sort of was a little bit serendipitous. And I think now that I've done my project, I've thought a lot more critically about comics. And I'm glad it's sort of one of those situations where it still works out when you put a little bit more thought into it. But I think it was definitely sort of an on the cusp answer at an interview that I then felt like, not that I was tied to the project, but it was like something that people were really excited about, and that got me really excited about it. And now that I'm doing it, I have like a much deeper appreciation and interest in comics moving forward.
Yeah, that's really cool. And I've, just to let everyone know, I've seen parts of the comic. Actually, I've seen it all. And it looks great. Amy's doing a great job. Amy's doing a great job. So Our next question is, what did you think SciComm was before you entered this program? And I think this is a question that we both have very interesting answers to.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really great question. I think I honestly maybe had never thought about the field in a very like formalized and articulate manner before this internship. Like, I don't know if, like, I think if somebody had approached me on the street and said, oh, like, what are your thoughts on science communication? I just from the words could maybe piece together what it was, but I had never like distinctly thought about it as a career path or as a field that people are working in. But yeah, I think if you were to ask me, I guess 10 weeks ago what I thought it was, I would have probably stuck to really traditional mediums of science communication. So looking at magazine articles, blogs, sort of mediums that are more journalistic in nature. I think since then, my like definition or just thoughts on what counts as science communication, what actually is engaging as science communication material is really expanded. But yeah, I think at that time would have just said basically like written articles about science that are easier to read for everyday people compared to sort of research journals or articles.
Wow, that's really different than what we both came in talking about. Because when me and Amy first like met each other and we're like talking, we're like, what are we doing? Like, what are we doing here? Like, we couldn't even explain it to ourselves, let alone people who don't like aren't in like STEM or science or anything.
Yeah.
And my parents still don't know.
Mine either, so that's okay.
Yeah.
I think that's how we first bonded, because we both didn't know what we were doing at all.
Yeah, we were just like, so how would you explain this to like a random person?
Yeah, hypothetically.
Hypothetically. And we had no answer, but now we do. So I say that's a win. Okay, so our next question is kind of in line with what I just asked is, what has been the hardest part of being a science communicator or learning as you learn what that means?
Yeah, I mean, I think beyond what you just alluded to of just like you try to explain what you do and people like don't really get it. They're like, so you're a scientist? You're like, oh, not quite. And I think it's like such a broad field that it's really hard to sort of concisely explain to you. But beyond just sort of the difficulties of like, what is it that you're doing this summer? I think for me personally, especially with my project, it's been like using the appropriate language. So with science communication, right, like the goal is to make information about science like more accessible, more engaging, and that means constantly thinking about, you know, your word choice or your art choice. Like, are you going to lose somebody there? And I think word choice in particular has been really hard for me because I'm writing with a target demographic of middle and high schoolers. But it's been at least 4 or 5 years since I've been in high school, and I don't have anybody in my life that is currently like in high school or middle school. So there's also no sort of control check of like, hey, like, does this sentence make sense? Like, does this language make sense? And so I found that I tend to use language that my mentors are like, that's not appropriate for a middle or high schooler. Like, they aren't gonna know what that means. Like, we don't want to like make them feel, you know, unintelligent or to struggle with the material, because the goal is to make it more accessible and fun. And for a little bit of context, I have now twice this summer been told by people that I like just met that I use words that they don't know or have never actually heard someone say in person before. So that's sort of where we're coming from. And I think it's just something that I've gotten so used to writing academic research papers in college, where it's like you're using big fancy words, not necessarily that you have to. Like, I think clear is always better, but tend to use like really big fancy words, and like that's the discourse that you're having with friends is using those words. And so it sort of becomes a blind spot when you're actually writing for a different audience. And if you don't keep that in mind intentionally the entire time, like I've been failing to do, you end up getting a lot of edits that are just along the lines of like, you need to change this, like this is too complicated. And I also tend to overwrite. Like I will send texts that people tell me should be emails. So also just like editing and like cutting down. So generally I guess writing is my problem, which doesn't bode well for my role, but that's okay. We're working on it.
Yeah, I think me and you talked about this. We were talking about how I love the word irk. So I'm always like, oh, that really irked me. And then my brothers would be like, what are you even talking about right now?
Yeah.
So I definitely understand that. And the overwriting, I definitely get that. Which is hard to kind of like make that shift. But I think you've been doing a really good job at shifting.
Oh, thanks, Tala.
Really. Yeah.
We've been helping each other in the basement. 2 peas in a pod.
Yeah, we've been helping each other a lot, which is great. I'm so happy that there's another psychom intern with me, going through it with me. But so this is kind of, I guess you can talk about it from the perspective of a science communicator or from just science in general, but how does your personal identity inform your science?
Yeah, I think as a science communicator, I think it's a little crazy that I'm currently in a role where communicator is like literally a part of the title, because I growing up was really like nervous, very shy, very introverted. And so the fact that like communications is what I'm working in right now, like I don't think I could have foreseen that coming a couple years ago. But I think one of those sort of beyond just sort of being introverted and quiet, like I think I found that actually in many ways is an asset, in particular to this role, because when I'm sitting in sort of the team meetings with the other digital engagement members, like so much of it is like you go onto the public floor or you're listening to what other people are doing. And it's like, you're not necessarily engaging at that point when you're just sort of doing the background research of like, what might somebody find exciting? And I think a lot of it is having to just like take your time and like walk through the aquarium and like find snails with cute little sea urchins like attached with, and they're shaking. And so I think that sort of attention to, or that enjoyment of being by myself and being more reflective and taking my time, which is something that I originally thought would always be a detriment in sort of the workplace. I felt that, you know, generally the culture of work in America is very much geared towards extroverts. But I found that like there are spaces where, and points during the process where that is actually helpful. And in addition to that, I have a tendency to be indecisive, and or you can reframe it as being just like very excited about a lot of different things. And I think I felt like a lot of shame about it, especially towards the end of college, because I go to UC Berkeley, which is this massive school. And I have friends who are absolutely amazing and they're so good at what they do and they know exactly what they want and they like go for it and they're like doing amazing in their careers in their grad school, et cetera. But I was someone who like didn't know what I wanted to major in when I came in, and my friends were like, you're never going to graduate or you're going to major in everything. Like I switched around. I was like interested in history of medicine, and then I like fell in love with herbs and started doing bio stuff, and then it was like interdisciplinary stuff. So I have sort of like bopped around a lot academically, and I always felt a little behind because I hadn't narrowed down what I wanted to do and what I wanted to study. And so when Tal and I had our first meeting with the digital engagement team with our mentors, they like put up this slide and it said disparate experiences make you smarter. And there was just sort of like a little bullet point, like arrow kind of like map of each member of the team and sort of how their like sort of seemingly unrelated experiences all led them here and actually make them better science communicators. And so I think that for me that like felt so validating. Like I felt so good and safe in that space, I think for the first time ever, of like, oh, the fact that I am excited by a lot of things and can't quite pinpoint what I want to do isn't like a negative, like it's actually bringing something to the table. And I think for me this summer, working within this department, it's been a lot of like realizing things that I used to think were weaknesses, like actually like can be a strength in different contexts. And I think ultimately like with science communication, so much of like what you learn is that like everything is sort of marketing, which I sort of hate as an introvert because I don't like networking. Like I like to be quiet and sort of do things by myself, but it is so much of it is like cultivating experience and knowledge and like hobbies or interests that make you an interesting person to talk to, that make you somebody that someone would want to interview with. And so I think that also has been sort of a really big part of how my personal identity has impacted at least my science communication work here. But also like beyond, I think even just in any type of research that I've conducted, like I've always been interested in research questions that are interdisciplinary in nature and sort of tie in threads from a lot of different disciplines. And I think that is very much due to the fact that I have an academic background that sort of spans a lot of different fields, which is really cool because I think more and more like solutions to world problems need to be interdisciplinary. Like you can't just be insular and try to figure it out within your respective field because the real world is messy and complicated and it's not all neatly like categorized and bundled. But yeah, I guess the last thing I'll touch on is as like someone who's female identifying, within my research, especially, this isn't necessarily STEM, but in the history of medicine, like the lived experience of like walking into a room and knowing that probably like half the people and mostly men are not going to listen to you at all and like not going to believe your stories, not be interested in talking to you. And I think that for me, like in my historical research and as a science communicator, like has made me more interested in uplifting sort of marginalized voices or untold stories. And in history, we call it like listening for the silences in the archives, or like what exists in the margin of the archive. So stuff that like people haven't historically thought were important, or perspectives that people didn't historically think we would want to study moving forward. And so I think coming from like being Asian, being woman, that sort of background definitely informs my interest in like the types of stories that I want to tell. That was really rambly, but yeah.
No, I loved it. There's a lot there that I want to touch on. I think one is the like being an introvert, because I feel like in SSI, there's a ton of us that are introverts. I don't think I'm an introvert all that much, but like, you know, there definitely is a space for us in science and in science communication where being an introvert, or like however it is that you need like your space and your quiet, like there's a lot of value in that too, rather than just like constantly pushing like extrovertness. Not that there's anything bad with that either, but
yeah, I would definitely agree. And I just want to touch on the fact that I think like mentorship here is really cognizant of that, or like Lauren Esposito, who's one of the program directors, and I interviewed her for my comic, she had said that like she's very intentional at inviting people in. And I think that is something that always really intimidated me as an introvert, is like having to put yourself out there and be like, hi stranger, like my name is Amy and like I want to do XYZ, like work with you. And so I think the fact that like people are becoming more cognizant, not just for introverts, but for people where like maybe culturally like it isn't the norm to put yourself out there, or like you might feel a lot of imposter syndrome because maybe you're first gen, et cetera. I think it's great to be in an academy where the mentors that we have like are aware of that and are making efforts to like reach out their hand instead of waiting for us to like come to them. And I hope that like that becomes more pervasive in science and just in sort of every field, because I think that's how you get more diverse perspectives.
Definitely. And I also like in particular like how Laurel and Arya are co-mentors, just to let people know, they kind of were just like, how do you like, what do you guys want us to like really be like scheduling meetings like every day checking in on you, or do you prefer like this method, like what works for you? And I think it helps with the intimidation aspect you were talking about, where you're like, especially coming into SciComm and we didn't really know much about it, to kind of be like, hey, like what do you need, how do you work, rather than being like, this is how I do things and this is what you're going to follow, which kind of a lot of other mentors maybe might do, or like other mentoring styles might do, which might work for people. But I'm glad that we've had that. And also talking about the disparate careers, when we had a early career panel, and Emily Horwitz, she was telling us about how some people reached out to her and they were like, your resume is kind of like so wacky, it's all over the place, but we love it, it's so unique, it's so different. And she was even telling us that that's what helps inform a lot of her writing and a lot of her projects, is kind of just being curious about everything and trying everything. And like, I think it's hard when I think me and you kind of share this experience where we grew up being told this is the way to do one thing, and it's like you have to choose this one path, and in order to choose this one path you have to go through each of these steps, and it's like it kind of is very rigid, it's not very like fluid. And knowing that, hey, like it's actually better, or not better, but like really great if you are like kind of moving through everything, has kind of made me be like, oh, like okay, then I'm gonna pick up this interest and I'm gonna pick up that interest, because it's like I want to do more things, but I thought that it wouldn't add value, you know?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think like you and I have talked, I think literally like first or second week of us physically being in the academy, we like had to talk about like our mini existential crisis of like, where do we go from here? Like, what are we going to do? And I think at least for me at that point, like I didn't really like writing resumes or doing applications, because it always felt like you had to make every part of your life make sense. Like it all had to be a very clear thread, and it had to be wrapped up in a really pretty bow. And I was like, how am I going to like explain history of medicine in relation to herpetology? Like that, like I at the time like didn't have like a way to connect those threads, and it felt like a deficit of like someone would look at that my resume and be like, oh, she's like flaky, like she's slidey, like she doesn't really know what she wants. But I think especially in science communication, because other sort of science communication folks here at the academy have really sort of harped on the fact that like having varied interests like is a strength, like that's not something you should suppress. And I think that's like just in terms of life really great, because I think you should never like be turned or be discouraged from pursuing something you really want to pursue just because you think it's like gonna look weird on a resume or that somebody's not gonna get it. And so I think it's been great that both of us have sort of gotten to get validated by various people here, that like being super explorative and adventurous is not a bad thing.
Definitely. Well, talking about how your perspective kind of science has changed, your psychom has changed, and like jumping back and forth between like different things. How has this internship, like, or this psychom lens changed your future career plans, or like how you frame science?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I have it all figured out. I think it'd be great if I was like, yeah, like after this summer, I know exactly what I want to do. And I have a feeling that I think maybe I'll never quite get there. Like I'll always want to keep exploring and doing different things. But I actually, at the start of this internship and still currently, I'm applying to sort of scholarships that would fund a grad program. And I think one thing that, like when I was writing those essays, it was pretty early on in me doing my project. And I think at that point, like I just wanted to find a way to tie in the fact that I had an internship at the Cal Academy into my application. And so when they were asking like, oh, like choose a program of interest and like justify it, I was mostly looking at history of medicine programs because that's sort of where my academic background lies. And it's something that I really love doing. But I was trying to find ways to like also do like a second master's in like comic design, or like be like, oh, like I want to do history of medicine at this institution specifically because there is a professor who looks at like multimedia, like non-traditional ways of engaging with the public, like through their research. Like I remember I read one professor like put on plays about like the HIV/AIDS epidemic in their respective countries. And so I was like, oh, like I too like want to find these like more novel, engaging ways to take whether it's medicine or science, like outside of academia or the clinic, and to move it to the public and to have, you know, fruitful discourse and engagement there. And I like joke that with my friends that sometimes I'll find something I like and make it my whole personality, but like low key, that is exactly I think what's happened with this internship is like I'm now really interested in graphic medicine. I was like talking to a professor at San Francisco State University, Nick, who like studies comics. And so on the one hand, I think I have this new interest that I like originally thought would just be concentrated in this summer, but I think now like I want to expand this more. And I think beyond that, just like the skills I think you learn in science communication are so applicable to any field that you go into. And I think it's like I originally was pre-med for a little bit of context, and like scientists, physicians, I think they all like could do better at communicating their science, especially in our current political climate, like coming off of the pandemic and sort of eroding trust in public institutions. Like we're seeing more and more that we need to sort of step outside of like our ivory towers and actually like talk to people, engage with them, and to do science or to do research or medicine that matters to communities, and to not just let it sort of be an afterthought of like, oh, I want to get funding, so like let me try to find a way to connect this to like having some positive impact. And I feel like I've lost the thread of the question, but I guess my TLDR version is I like am very interested in potentially staying within the realm of science communication as a future academic path. But even if I don't, I think the skills that I've learned and sort of the ways in which people think about problems and think about engaging with the public within this space, I want to take with me to whatever sort of future career or careers I end up pursuing down the road.
Yeah, definitely. That's awesome. And I love that like it's given you a different like lens of where you might want to go. And like I think it's totally okay to not know like where you want to go or like where you end up, because again, like disparate career paths, and it'll all get you somewhere, maybe in different periods of your life. Excuse me.
You're so good.
I just got a weird voice crack right there. Okay. So our final question, but just as a reminder to people watching, if you want to drop a question below, please feel free, and we will ask Amy as we wrap up this final question. But Amy, I want to know, what is your biggest science hot take?
Yeah, this is actually, I think, the question I've been dreading the most, because I had one and then Joseph stole it because he also works with herbs. But I was thinking about this on my walk over this morning. Mind you, this is like on 2 hours of sleep thought, so apologies if it's not very polished. But I was thinking a little bit about like what science means to me and sort of what are the core values, or like what do I find engaging about science. And I think ultimately what it sort of boils down to is for me, science is about like curiosity and about wonder. And it's about, I think, that feeling you get as a kid when you like don't know something, but you're so excited to like ask questions about it. And I think along the way, at least for me personally, as I was growing up, like that like natural curiosity and like confidence and bravery to like explore the unknown was sort of like whittled away a little. And I think a large part of that is how we teach science, especially to younger generations. And to be clear, like this is not me bashing on public school educators. Like I fully did public schools like from elementary school all the way now through college. And I think public school educators deserve the world. Like they deserve so much more recognition and so much more pay. But I think the culture that we've created within just sort of school and education in general when it comes to science is sort of this idea that there is only one right answer, and like if you don't get it, you have failed. And like I understand sort of like you want to have like metrics where you can quantify how a student is doing. That is a whole other, I think, beast in itself to talk about, of like standardized testing. But I think ultimately the way that we sort of teach science, especially to little kids, it is not like you're not taught to ask your own questions. And I think that is such a fundamental part of being human, is to be curious and to ask questions. And I remember like literally my first class at Berkeley, it was actually an English class, and the professor was like, okay, like you have an essay due in X amount of time. Like there's no prompt, like you come up with your own question and then answer it. And that sort of completely floored me, because I was like, I have to come up with the question. Like I was like, oh my gosh, like I didn't know where to start. And I think even in this internship, like we've had prolonged discussions about how do you ask a good question? Like how do you know what a good question is? And I think oftentimes in education, like you're given a question, you're told to problem solve, and you sort of, it becomes instilled that that is the only way to do work. But I think especially in STEM, like that's not the case. It's like you have to come up with the questions and you have to be creative and sort of be engaged with the world. And I think the way that we teach science sort of really detracts from that. Like it doesn't teach you to ask questions, and it doesn't teach you to connect with nature or with other people, which for me is really what science also is about, is like finding ways to be curious and to be interested in other people, in our place in the world, and our relationship with other things. And so I wish that like the way that we taught science was more sort of rooted in that like natural sense of curiosity, and like not, you know, like being against kids who think differently or who ask questions that aren't in the lesson plan. And I think also like from like a top down level, like I think science as a culture can do better at that. Like I understand that like academic journals are nice in the sense that they're framed that like we had this specific question and this is how we approached it and these were our results. But I think if you were to ask any author of a research paper, like, was it really that simple? Like probably not. Like I think they would look like that meme of the guy who's like really tired in front of like a crazy like wall of stuff and is like pointing to a bunch of things, where it's just like, no, actually like we had this original question and we tried this and like this method didn't work, but then that led to another question, and then like sort of ping pongs around. And I think if we were more, also a little bit more transparent of the fact that the scientific process isn't, you know, question, hypothesis, method, et cetera, then maybe from an earlier age, I think kids would be engaging in science in a way that is more reflective of, I think, just sort of human nature as a whole, but also of the way that real like scientists, or not real, but like professional scientists and researchers are engaging with these like big questions that they want to answer.
Yeah, definitely. That's when you first started talking, I was like standardized tests, and then you mentioned it right after, and I was like, yeah. And I think like both me and you like have similar experiences where we were very like on track, like, you know, in school. And it's not to say that we're not like successful, we are, but it's like the burnout that comes from that, or like the emotional exhaustion that comes from that, and just like all the personal issues that come from like going through school in this certain way and being forced and what is the word, like expected to follow these certain metrics, or like, and trying to reach those metrics. And like, yeah. And touching on what you said about, I'm totally blanking.
It's okay.
It's been a long day. Touching on when you were talking about school, what were you saying right now? I'm so sorry.
Like the way that we teach young kids science.
Oh, okay. Now I remember. Yeah, when you touched on your professor that was like, yeah, you make up your own question. I had the same experience where like last semester, I was in this like ethics class, like this justice and ethics class, and my professor was like, okay, like this final paper is worth like 30% of your grade. And I was like, okay, what's the question? What are you doing? And he was like, no, like you have to come up with it on your own. And I'm like, what do you mean I have to come up with it on my own? And he was like, yeah, you have to do it on your own. And I'm like, but what if it's not a good enough question? What if it's not this? What if it's not that? And I think because we've been so constrained by like grades, um, and like wanting to be like an A or wanting to keep like, some people like need to keep a certain grade point average so that they can keep their scholarships or their financial aid. And it's like being given free reign is, I think, so novel, which is really bad. It shouldn't be that novel for us to be like, oh, here's something where like you find a topic you're really interested in relation to what we're learning in the class, and you tell me what you want to tell me. And it's
Yeah.
like, what?
No, I definitely agree. I think the paradox of choice really comes into play in those situations. And actually, since we like had that question about identity, I think it's also maybe one of the first times when you're asked explicitly within an academic context to bring your personal interests and your personal experiences and perspectives into choosing the type of work that you find meaningful and that you want to do. Because I think up until then, like everybody gets the same questions, right? It's like, do this experiment, do this lab report, etc. And it feels really weird to suddenly be like, oh, well, now it's like, what's important to you? Like, what do you think is impactful? And like, how do you justify that? And I think there's also that element of like being very vulnerable when you are bringing like your whole self into a historically exclusionary and discriminatory field, which is just, I think, academia and STEM in general. But yeah, it's really hard. And it feels like something that shouldn't be that hard. But I think, like you said, like you go through so many years of having that sort of drilled out of you that when it comes up, you're just sort of like a little bit flabbergasted and like, oh, like I did not think that I would have to come up with my own question. Like, this is hard.
Definitely the part where you were talking about like vulnerability is that when you are given that platform to talk about whatever you want, I think if you don't come from if you come from an ethnic background or like just a different background from the status quo, it's like very scary to put yourself out there, even if it's only your professor and TA that are reading it. It's like you're asking to like dig deeper and like show vulnerability in an academic sense, which I don't think people are ever really asked to do. At least not when I was growing up, I was never asked about that. And that could just be because of how or where I grew up. But it's like, I don't know if I want to choose like a topic that really, really speaks to me, because if I choose that and then like you give me a 50%, then I'm going to feel like crappy about it, But it's also like, even if you do give me a good grade, like, do I want you to know about me this way? Like I think it asks you to take a little bit of a risk or a little bit of a leap, which I don't know that we're taught to ever do.
Yeah. And I think it asks you to take a leap in a space where you may or may not already know that you have support and feel safe. Like, I think we've had other interns in this internship say that like this internship in this space and like the community that the program directors and the mentors have been really intentionally creating feels really safe. And so they're able to like explore these like deeper questions and reflect on their own sort of path and beyond just sort of STEM, but like their own lives and where they want to go from here. Yeah, I think often in academia, you're asked to take leaps and to be vulnerable in ways when like you don't know if it's like safe. And I remember like my herpetology GSI was like the first time I had like an openly queer like academic instructor, and this was my like second semester junior year. And like he talked very candidly about how being openly queer like has impacted his career. And yeah, so I think like just in general, like academia can be a really scary space, especially if, like you're first gen or you're a person of color or from historically marginalized identity. And to ask you to sort of be personal and to be vulnerable, I think is a really big ask when the culture itself like is not necessarily guaranteed to be safe or welcoming for everybody.
Definitely. And it's hard definitely hard if you don't have that support system, like you said. But I'm glad that there are programs like ours out there that do welcome people and like make them feel safe, because it's like really great having met everyone in the program this summer. I'm like, oh, I love you guys. You guys are like my family now, our little SSI family.
Yeah, and I think it's great watching everyone like grow into themselves and like become really confident and like really excited about what they do.
Yes.
Because it's sort of crazy like how much change, like I guess at this point was week 9, like 9 weeks can make.
Yeah, and also how like we like love leaning onto one another for support. Like our Discord channel, like we just text each other like, hey, like I don't know what to do for this, and then somebody will have an answer. And even if you don't, like, oh, like here's a suggestion. Like you yesterday helping Dylan out on the blog post pitch. He's like, I don't know what to write about. And you're like, well, you talked about this and it's really cool. And he was like, oh my god, light bulb moment. It's you definitely need a support system.
Yeah, and I think I like completely second everything. I think this internship, I like love all of the interns. They're all so fantastic, and I can't wait to see what they do sort of after this, because I think they're all going to be great. I know they're all going to do great and amazing things. But yeah, I think it's really sweet that like all of us have like really gotten along and like are really excited for one another, and it's not competitive at all. It's more like I'm so excited to see you succeed, and like I can't wait to see what you do next.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. Well, that's a great note to end on.
That wraps up us going over time by like a factor of 2.
Damn. Okay, it's okay. We went over it with Ethan too. So that wraps up all of our official questions for Amy. Thank you so much for joining us today. But before we officially end, we would like to encourage everyone to follow us on our social media channels on Instagram and Twitter, which are on the banner on the screen below me, so that you can virtually join us for the rest of our adventures this summer, which is coming to an end. Sad. We will post any contact information that Amy has shared with us in the chat. I don't know if you... Actually, there is.
Oh, there is. That's okay. I think we can also just put it in the social media.
Okay, so just look at our Instagram, basically. Go follow us on there. And then tune in today at 3:05 p.m. to listen to our next series installation with me. So have a great day, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. Bye.